You get onto a job site after months in the office. You have your drawings in hand or on your iPad or however you hold them. You're walking the floor, checking what you see against what you drew. The walls are where the walls are supposed to be. The openings look right. Your scope, as far as you can tell, is tracking. And when you leave, you feel like the visit went fine. But 3 weeks later, a construction RFI comes in and the mechanical contractor needs clarification on a roof penetration. The penetration is right where you drew it. The problem is that 3 other trades needed that same 12 inches of ceiling and nobody coordinated it. Your drawings were complete, but they were complete because you were only looking and only checking them against themselves. That's the version of stress you don't really get prepared for. Not the stress of too much work, but the stress of not knowing what you didn't know you were supposed to be looking at when you're looking at a set of drawings. And the harder truth is that working more carefully on your drawings wouldn't have caught it. More detail or more time or just more effort, none of that closes the gap that you didn't know exists. And today, I want to talk about where stress in practice typically comes from and what changes when you can finally see it. You're listening to The Practice of Practice, a podcast for architects, designers, and emerging professionals navigating the gap between school and real work. We focus on the realities most people only learn through experience: workflow, judgment, responsibility, and time. It's not theory, it's practice. There's a particular kind of stress, especially early on in your career, that doesn't fit the categories people usually allocate stress to. It's not burnout because you haven't been grinding on something for months. It's not overwhelm because the list that you were given probably wasn't impossible. And it's not a frustration in the usual sense because nothing went visibly wrong. It's closer to a specific suspicion. Suspicion that what you just handed in to your supervisor was too simple for what was actually needed. That the task asked for a level of thinking that you didn't bring to it, or that somewhere between receiving the direction you were giving and producing the work, you missed the real ask. And the hardest part is that you can't really confirm it because you don't know if the person reviewing your work will come back with comments. And if they don't, you don't know if the silence that you get from them means that it was fine or it means that they'll just deal with it later on their own. And you don't know if fine in your office means fine or means acceptable for now. So you just sit with it. You move on to the next task, but the discomfort doesn't leave you. It sort of drops below the surface and just runs in the background. The architects who move through this faster are the ones that learn to interrupt that cycle early, not by waiting to see if the feedback confirms the suspicion, but by asking what could have been taken further, what else was needed, or what the person on the other end of the desk or task was actually looking for. This sounds simple, but most people don't do it fast enough, because if you sit and ask questions constantly, it feels like admitting that you didn't know something. And early on in your career, not knowing already feels like a problem. So the gap between what you're producing and what's expected just stays invisible. You're not surfacing it, and neither is anyone else, not your supervisor, a mentor. The only way it eventually closes is when a red line arrives, which is really the least efficient, most expensive way for everyone involved to learn. When you can't locate the source of stress, the default move is effort. I'm guilty of this. Do you spend more time on the parts that you do know? Do you put more detail in the things that you're already confident in? Do you spend extra time making sure all your annotations are super aligned and everything fits within a perfect square? The parts you focus on are the parts that you know the most about. The parts you're less sure about tend to stay more thin because if you touch them and turn them in, it risks exposing them. It's not really laziness, it's more of a camouflage. if the parts that you can control look complete, but the rest doesn't show up. It doesn't work though. It will get caught eventually. The gap doesn't close because the drawings got polished. The gap closes when the understanding behind the drawing changes. And that only happens when the expectation was clear enough to hit in the first place. Most of the time, it wasn't. But it's not a personal failure on your part, it's a structural one built into how the tasks get handed down from supervisors and how early career architects learn to receive them. Working faster won't reduce this stress. Most stress in practice comes from unclear priorities or an unclear scope or more so an unclear responsibility. It's not the workload. Unclear priorities, you don't know what matters most right now. Everything on the list feels equally urgent because no one told you how to triage it. So you treat it all as equally important, a rational response to missing information. But it means you're spending the same energy on low stakes work as high stakes work, and you won't know the difference until the feedback arrives. If you have unclear scope, you probably don't know where your work ends and where the next person begins. Say you're on a renovation project and the supervisor says, make sure we have a detail showing how the new work ties into that existing wall and the structure of the existing building. You know wall sections, so you draw that. You draw a wall section. New construction tying into the existing roof, which is a direct response to what you're asked. But what was actually needed was a plan detail. Needed something to show expansion joint systems, a hard connection, roof integration at the point where old and new meet. You needed the kind of detail that tells a contractor exactly how to execute the work, not just what it looks like in section, but how it connects in plan, where the tolerances are, in which trade owns which edge. In isolation, the wall section wasn't wrong, but it was wrong for this situation. But the situation was never fully described to you. So the markup probably came back with red lines, an explanation of what was missing. And then the work had to be redone, which meant your time, the supervisor's time, and hours pulled from a project fee that was already being watched. But this isn't a talent failure. It's a scope failure. The task crossed the desk without enough information attached to it for you to hit the actual target. Unclear responsibility works differently, but it produces the same result. You're not sure who owns the decision, so you carry the weight of it without the authority to resolve it. You're holding stress for a call that isn't yours to make, and you can't put it down because you're not sure if it's safe to. That doesn't go away when the task is finished. More often than not, it probably follows you out of the office. And they're not talent problems, they're just framing problems. Your instruction was incomplete. Maybe the direction brief wasn't ever finished in the first place. Most project conversations set a direction, but that's not the same as setting an expectation. And early career architects spent a lot of energy working from direction when what they actually needed was expectation. And this doesn't happen because anyone is being careless. Senior staff assume that if something needs clarification, you'll ask the question. Early career staff, on the other hand, assume that if they need to ask the question, they're already behind. The gap lives between those two assumptions. We keep talking about assumptions. Nobody designed it. It exists structurally, probably in almost every office on almost every project. The supervisor who handed over the detail request has resolved that connection condition before. The level of development or which trade owns which is obvious to them, so they don't think that they need to spend time to explain it. You haven't resolved it before, so you take your best read of the situation and produce what you think is expected. Then when the markup arrives, it registers to you as failure. You think, I got that wrong, or I wasn't even given what I needed to get it right. And both of those are probably true. That's the honest version. And being in the field makes it worse before it gets better. The first few months that you end up going to a job site probably feel completely foreign because you'll show up every few weeks, probably for only a couple of hours here and there. And each time you go, The building has changed. Walls are up. Ceilings are closing in. Trades are layering on top of each other in ways that don't look like any drawing that you produced. You didn't see it happen. You're watching a film with most of the frames removed. And the instinct, because the architectural drawings are what you know, is to use them as your frame of reference. You walk the site checking your layer. Walls where the wall should be. Openings reading correctly. Your scope, as you can tell, as far as you can tell, is tracking. The architecture drawings, though, are only one layer of a building. You have the mechanical, plumbing, structural, electrical. That's the other 40% of what's actually being built. But if you're not reading those sets, you're not reading the building. You're reading a portion of it and assuming the rest is someone else's problem. It's not entirely, but it creates RFIs, and the RFIs that come from that gap aren't small. Mechanical systems that need accommodation you didn't draw, or pipe routes that conflict with structure, or a riser that's down the middle of a room and needs a chase that you didn't draw, and you don't want it exposed, neither does the owner. There's even roof penetrations that your drawings treat as simple pass-throughs, but the MEP set treats as complex assemblies requiring blocking, flashing, and clearances called out by the general contractor or the roofing contractor that you never specified, so they don't have it called out. Your scope looked complete because you checked it against itself. The moment you start checking it against everything else, you found the 40% you'd been missing. And that's not a mistake that you make because you're careless. It's a mistake that you make because nobody told you to look there. You were thrown into the task and expected to float. And floating, when you haven't even learned to read the water yet, costs something. It costs time. It costs project fees. It costs RFIs that land mid-construction when the building is half closed and the fix is 3 times harder and more expensive than it would have been at the drawing stage. And it costs a version of credibility with the contractor, with the owner, with the people in your own office who are watching how you handle it. None of that is inevitable. It's the results of expectations that were never made visible on both sides, you and the supervisor. The question isn't who's responsible for the gap. The question is what closes it. And the answer is the same whether you're the one handing down the task or the one receiving it. Someone has to make the expectation visible. And if nobody does it for you, you have to learn to do it yourself. A specific behavior that works is asking for a reference before you start. Don't ask, "What do you want me to do?" or a general request for more direction. Ask for a reference, something concrete to calibrate against. Say something like, "Hey, is there a detail we've done before that's close to this condition? Or is there a level of detail or development that you have in mind for this? Is there some project that we've done in the past that I can pull for the connection type here?" Those types of questions do 2 things. It'll get you an anchor, something to measure your work against before you hand it in. But it tells the person you're working with that you're trying to calibrate, not just do the task and move on. You're not waiting to be handed the answer either. You're trying to understand what the answer looks like so you can build toward it. Supervisors read that differently than a general ask for help. It reads as someone getting oriented, not someone who doesn't know what they're doing. The relationship shifts slightly. You're a collaborator trying to understand the target, not a task receiver waiting for instructions. But a reference alone isn't enough. The reference only does its job if someone explains why it's done that way, why the condition is required, or what would happen if it had been handled differently. Without that context, the reference is just a shape to copy. With it becomes a principle you can carry to the next condition and the one after that. When you're on the receiving end of a markup, look for that second layer. The good ones don't just tell you how to fix it. They tell you why the fix matters, what the contractor reads, how the GC bids a hard connection versus a field condition, which trade owns which edge, and why it changes the detail. If that markup you receive doesn't have a layer like that, ask for it. Say, could you help me understand why a plan detail works here instead of a section? Or even ask, what would the contractor have done with what I drew? Those questions do more than fix the current drawing. They close the gap between receiving a direction and understanding an expectation. And then they tend to open larger conversations, one that might pull in more of the team or become more of a learning exercise, more of the context, more of what you actually need to know to stop making the same mistake in a different form on the next project. The cycle that keeps producing the same red line breaks here. Not when the drawing gets corrected, when the understanding behind the drawing changes. That only happens when the expectation was made visible by whoever was willing to make it visible first. Stress in practice is information. When the stress doesn't match the workload, when you're drained in a way that doesn't map out how much you actually did, that's a signal worth reading into. It's not about your capacity or about the clarity of the frame you're working inside. Early on, most people don't know how to read it. It sits there. It's something to push through. It says work harder, stay later, add more detail. But once you learn it, that changes. The discomfort that used to be vague becomes specific. Specific to a priority that was never ranked, a scope that was never defined, a responsibility that was never assigned. Specific problems are solvable. Vague ones just compound. The stress you're carrying right now may not be about how much you're doing. It may be about how clearly you understand what you're doing it for. Make the expectation visible. The stress follows. What happens when the stress stops running in the background? When you're not burning energy on misread signals, when focus stops going to the wrong problem, the work changes. The details you understand fully become reference points. The expectations you surface clearly become patterns you recognize faster. Each conversation that opens a larger one leaves something behind. It doesn't happen all at once. It'll happen slowly across multiple projects. And then one day it's obvious. That's what we're getting into next week. How practice compounds slowly. The practice of architecture is not intuitive, but it is learnable. So don't worry, we'll keep building from here. This podcast only works if it gets passed along. Not because of me, but because the hardest parts of practice are usually learned in isolation. If this episode put words to something you've been struggling with, share it with someone earlier in practice, or leave a comment naming the moment that hit. I'm doing this because I remember how long it took to realize that I wasn't behind. I just wasn't being taught. Most of what feels like a personal failure in this profession is actually a shared pattern. The more we name those patterns, the faster we all get better. I'll see you in the next one.